Hey, what's up everybody? I'd like to welcome you to another audio programmer tutorial. In this tutorial, what we're going to do is continue on with some of the work that we were doing from the last Cmajor tutorial, where we were creating a custom user interface for our Cmajor plugin. So the three objectives for this tutorial are styling our user interface using CSS, creating the sliders that we need for our parameters using HTML, then connecting those sliders to the parameters that we have on the Cmajor side using our patch connection object. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know about the resources and services we have for you here at The Audio Programmer. Whether you'd like to learn about audio programming yourself through our books and community, looking for developers or advice through our recruitment and consulting services, or would like us to create a plugin for you through our development services, we offer all things audio programming. Come visit us at theaudioprogrammer.com to find out more. And without further delay, let's get started. So just a small note that if you want to follow along with this tutorial, you can actually grab it on the GitHub repository. Link is in the description below. I'm also coming at this from the perspective of a person who has more experience in C++ and is really coming into this JavaScript, HTML, CSS world as a beginner. So if there are better explanations or if anything is incorrect or anything can be improved, please feel free to put those suggestions constructively into the comments below. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to style our user interface using this getHTML method. So the way that we're going to do this is using CSS. First step to this is using our style tag to define where we want to begin and end our style definitions. Then we're going to put some space in here, and inside of this we're going to define some CSS. Inside our style tag, we're going to create a CSS class selector. So in this case, I'm just going to call it view-patch-element. And then I'm going to create some curly brackets. And inside here, I'm going to create the different styles of what I want for my user interface. Now, if I go over to w3schools.com, you can see in the CSS reference that the number of ways that we can style our user interface are immense. There's probably hundreds of different ways that we could do this here. For the sake of speed in this tutorial, I've actually created some styles beforehand, and I'm just going to paste those in here now. Most of those are pretty self-explanatory. So for example, just to go over a few of them, we have a font family, and in this case, we're using the Verdana font in sans serif style. And you can find a list of some of these fonts over on w3.org. Once again, all of this stuff is pretty widely available, and there are a lot of people who are experienced in this area. There's a list of different fonts there. Anybody who knows what it's like to import a font on using Juice knows how much of a pain it can be, and here it's quite easy, so we could just name it right here. The text align is in the center. You know, we got the width and the height set to 100%. There's a lot of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory. We're setting the background color to light blue, and that's pretty much what we're going to do for our simple styling for this user interface. Now, one essential step that we need to do in order to be able to get this styling to show up in our user interface is we need to add it to the class list of our HTML element. The way that we do this is by going back up to the constructor for the myView class that we have, and we're going to say this.classList.add, and then in here in quotes we're just going to put the name of the class that we created in CSS. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and load this patch, and what we should see is a blank user interface with a light blue background. So there we see our user interface, and it does indeed have a light blue background as we've declared. So everything is good to go so far. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is create a slider. So the first thing that I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a body tag for the body of our user interface. Inside this body tag, I'm going to create a division tag using the keyword div. And here I can set an ID if I want to come back to this later, and I will just call this controls. and then I will angle bracket out, and then once again I need to close this out. And in here is where I'm going to put my sliders. So let's create one slider now. So what I've done is I've gone to Google and just Googled in HTML slider, and it's brought me to this website, w3schools.com, and it has some code that I found here to create a slider. So we have this input type that is a range. So it's just a range from one value to another value. The minimum value is 1, maximum value is 100, default value is 50. The name of the class is called slider, and then you can give it an ID as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, copy it back over to my code here, like this, and I'm going to paste it, and I'm just going to adapt it to my needs. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to create the slider for our frequency in. So we have a minimum value of 20, a maximum value of 20,000, and an initial value of 300. So minimum value is going to be 20, maximum value is going to be 20,000, and the default value is going to be 300. And the name of this class, I'm going to change this from slider to param because it's one of our parameters. Now this is very important. The name of the ID for the slider needs to match the name of whatever we called the parameter in our Cmajor code. So in this case, ID needs to be frequency in. What I can also do is I can add a label for this slider. So after I've put in all of my inputs, I can just put what I want the label to be, and then I will close that input out. And now I have created my slider. I haven't connected it fully to my Cmajor code yet, but if everything is working properly, we should actually see a slider. So let's go ahead and run this now. So there we see a slider that is indeed called frequency. So we haven't really done anything to this. We haven't connected it to our Cmajor code yet. So we need to do that a little bit later, but you can see that we now see this slider. Okay. Going back to the web page for a second, what you'll be able to see if you scroll down a little bit further is that once you're in the web world, the world is really your oyster. So you could add styling and additional styling to how you want that slider to look, just with a little bit of CSS. I'm not going to do that in this tutorial because I'm sure you can pick that up pretty easily yourself, but you can see that there is so much customization that you can do once you get started. Okay, so the next step is where the actual magic happens. What we want to do is take the slider that we just created, that we've given an ID called frequency in, and what we're going to do is we're going to use the patch connection object to create a connection with the parameter that we have on the Cmajor side called frequency in. So we're going to do this within the connected callback method. Once again, this is a method that is coming straight from HTML element, and this is only run at the very beginning when the myView class is first initialized. So this only happens on initialization. It does not happen any other times throughout the lifetime of this class. So it just makes the connection, and then disconnected callback on destruction will disconnect these two sides. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we're going to look within our HTML code for the ID that we called frequency in, okay, which is our slider. And the way that we do that is that we can go to this, which is our class, and then we have this handy method called query selector. Okay, query selector is a method, and as we can see here in the web API documentation, it returns the first element that is a descendant of the element, which is the element is our class, that matches the specified group of selectors. Okay, so in this case, what we want to do is we want to look for the slider that is called frequency in. And the way that we do that is we create parentheses, and then this needs to go into a string literal here. The syntax is that you have to use a hashtag. And then here we just now put the name of the ID that we're looking for. Now what I could do is, if there is something that returns from this, I can store this in a local variable. What I will do, I will call this const freak slider equals the ID of the slider. So it equals the slider that has the ID frequency in. Okay, and I'm storing that in this variable called freak slider. I've made it const because I'm not going to be taking freak slider and making it equal to anything else at any other point in this class. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is define what we want to happen when we move the frequency slider. So for this case, what we can use is a function called onInput. So once again, there are so many things that you can do with a slider here. And for this case, we're going to use onInput to define what we want to happen when something changes or when we change the value of our slider. So we could do this by saying freak slider onInput. And then here, what I'm going to do is create a lambda function that is going to define what I want to happen. So if we were just thinking about this intuitively, we would say that when we change the value of the frequency slider, we want that to change the value of the frequency in parameter on our Cmajor patch, right? So the way that we could do this is by grabbing our patch connection. So that's once again the way that we can communicate with the Cmajor world. So we say this dot patch connection. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go over to the Cmajor API, and we can look through and see what functions are available to us from patch connections. So as you can see, there are quite a few of them. So I of course already know the one that we're going to call, which in this case is what's called send event or value. So we want to send the value of whatever the frequency slider is over to the parameter called frequency in. So just taking a look at the documentation here, it says sends a value to one of the patch's input endpoints. Okay, so there's a little bit more that you could do here. So for instance, if you wanted to ramp that value, so you'll see that if you're looking or listening to this very carefully, when the value is changed, that it steps a little bit. And if you wanted to smooth that out, you can smooth that out using another optional parameter called ramp frames, how many frames you want to use before it reaches its final destination. But we aren't going to worry about that for now. We're just trying to do something very basic. And here we have the parameters that we want as the endpoint ID and then the value that we want it to ramp to. Okay, so as you can see, what I've done is I've created the sliders with the same ID as what I have for the name of the endpoint IDs on the Cmajor side, and you can see why I'm doing that now. So we're going to call this function this.patchConnection.send event or value. Then once again, it takes two arguments, the endpoint ID. Now, since the name of the slider is the same name as what I have for the parameter on the Cmajor side, I can actually just call the name of the slider parameter using freakslider.id. And then what I want to do is, for the second argument, I want to pass the value of that. And so I could say freakslider.value, and that gives the value of whatever freak slider is over to the parameter on the C major side, and it changes it. Okay, so now we've defined what we want to happen if we change the slider and what we want to happen on the C major side. And what we want to do is now have reverse communication, which is that if something were to change the value of frequency in on the C major side, that it updates the slider on the HTML side. The way that we're going to do this is by creating a listener. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this variable. I'm going to call it freq listener. And I'm going to input a value. So this would be the value that would be coming in from the C major side. And once again, this is going to be a lambda function. And what we're going to do is that if the value changes from the C major side, then what we want to do is update the value of the frequency slider. So we will set the value of the frequency slider to whatever the input value is. Okay, so that looks a little bit weird until I do this next line of code, which is going to be this, and we're going to call our patch connection, and then we're going to add a parameter listener. And what that's going to be is for our freq slider ID. And then here we're going to input the frequency listener. Okay, so let's go over to add parameter listener in our documentation here. So I'm just going to look here for add parameter listener in patch connection. So this attaches a listener function that will be called whenever a specific parameter changes. So in this case, it's going to be the frequency in parameter that we have on the C major side. And then what it will do is it's taking then if the value of frequency in changes, then we're taking that value and we're inputting it into this lambda function to update the value of the frequency slider, so it updates the user interface. Okay. Now we want to do one more thing, which is that we want to, when we first call this connected callback, we want to initialize and update our frequency slider when we first initialize the patch, right? So the way that we do this is we call this, and we call our patch connection object again, and we call this function called request parameter value. Once again, since the slider and the C major side both have the same IDs, I can just call freq slider ID since I know that those two things have the same name. So let's go over to request parameter value in the C major API now. Request parameter value, and you will see what I mean here. So this will trigger an asynchronous callback to any parameter listeners that are attached, providing them with its up-to-date current value for the given endpoint. So what we're doing there is we are updating the slider to show the correct value of what we've initialized on our endpoint. So in this case, the initial value for that should show initially on frequency n would be 300. Okay, and that's essentially our connected callback for frequency slider. Now, one thing that we could do is that when we disconnect, we want to make sure that there's a safe disconnection, and the only thing that we need to do here is call this, and we go back to our patch connection object, and what we want to do is remove the parameter listener. Okay, now let's go back, see what we need there. Remove parameter listener. and it removes the listener that was previously added with add listener parameter, and we just want to give it the endpoint ID, which once again is freq slider dot ID. Okay, and that safely removes it. Okay, so I did try to run this patch, and I saw that it wasn't actually working properly, and I found out why. The reason why is because this onInput function, if you look at the documentation, is actually with a lowercase I rather than a capital I. So if I just change this to a lowercase I and I run this, this should work properly. Great, so now you can see that that's actually working properly. Cool, so let's create our other slider for our gain volume, and then what we could do is we could do a little bit of cleanup and a little bit of styling and finish this tutorial up. So one thing that we're going to do is we're going to improve upon this code a little bit, make it a little bit more dynamic so that we don't have to add listeners and add sliders for every single parameter that we create. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this code around a little bit, and I'm going to just put a couple lines here. Now, the first thing that I'm going to address is this this way that we're able to update the user interface if the parameter in Cmajor changes. So the way that I'm going to extend this is rather than saying this dot freq listener, that's only going to be specific for frequency, I'm going to say this dot param listener, and that's going to be for all parameters rather than just for the frequency. And what we're going to do is we're going to look for an event. So we will just say that this event is just when something changes that in the Cmajor patch. Okay, and this is going to be a lambda function. And then what we want to do is inside here, I'm just going to create a slider. I'm going to make that equal to, and what we'll do is we're going to essentially look for the ID of the user interface element that matches with whatever it is that I have on the Cmajor side. So this is the reason why I keep the name of the parameter on the Cmajor side the same as the name of the ID on the user interface side, so that I'm just communicating with the same name, and that allows me to do these sort of things. So in this case, I'm going to do this query selector, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for the, I always do that, and I'm going to look for the user interface element, the slider that has the same name as whatever the endpoint ID is of whatever was changed on the Cmajor side. So in other words, if something changes on the Cmajor side, let's say frequency in changes on the Cmajor side, what it's going to do is it's going to call this lambda function, and it's basically going to say, hey, something changed from the Cmajor side. And then it's going to say the frequency in parameter changed. And what will happen is that it calls this function and it says, I'm looking for a slider that's called frequency in. That's why I keep the names of these the same. Okay. And then I'm going to create a line of code that says, okay, if we find a slider that matches the name of the parameter that changed on the Cmajor side, then I'm just going to update it. So I will say slider.value is equal to dot value. Okay, so that is a way that we can now do what we did before with the frequency listener, where we were updating the frequency slider if the frequency parameter changed on the C major side. Now, what's really cool is that if we go back to our C major API, there's actually a function called add all parameter listener, which is really cool because it attaches the listener function whenever the value of any parameter changes in the patch are changed. So it essentially does what we did for frequency. For the frequency endpoint, it does that for all of our endpoints. So what I can do is here I can say this dot patch connection add all parameter listener, and then all I need to do is just pass in this dot param listener that I created right here. This dot param listener is just going to call whenever there's something from the C major side that changes. So an event says, hey, I've changed something from the C major side. It says, okay, do I need to update any of my sliders? I'm going to look for a slider that has the same parameter name as what I've seen change in the C major side. If I see a slider that matches the parameter that I have on the C major side, then I update that slider with whatever the value is of the endpoint that changed. Okay, so now with that, what I can do is I can just get rid of this add parameter listener. So that's how we do that. And then another thing that we can do here is we can say that whenever there is any change in our user interface, that essentially the same thing that we just did here, but once again, we're doing this for the reverse. We're doing this for any change that happens in our user interface. What we do is we look into our patch connection, look into the C major patch, and look for a endpoint or a parameter that matches the name of the slider, and then we update that slider. So what I could do is use a for loop here, and I'm going to say for const, and I'll just call this param of this. And then there is a handy function in here. Once again, so if we go back here into our HTML documents, there's a handy function called query selector all. Okay, so search all elements with the class that's equal to whatever the class name is. So in this example, it's actually called example. In our situation is actually called param. So if we go down here, we have our class name is called param. So the way that we do this is we call this query selector all, and then what I put in here is dot param. Then what we want to do is the same type of thing that we did here for frequency sliders. So I can actually get rid of this here, and I will pop this in here, and I will pop this in here, and just update these. So here, what's going to happen is param, if it finds something, then what it's going to do is it's going to return the slider. And what I want to say is param dot on input. And what we will do is we will then update the C major patch using this function called send event or value. And rather than freak slider, we want this for any param, for whatever param that comes up. And so it will be our parameter ID, and then we're going to update it with whatever the slider value is. So maybe it would be more accurate to say const slider. That makes it a little bit more readable and a little bit more obvious what's happening there. Okay. And then same sort of thing, we want that to update all of our all of our sliders that are based on the endpoints that we get from our Cmajor patch. So once again, this would be the slider ID. So all of this only works if the names of your parameters are the same as the names of your IDs on your sliders. If you decide to call them different names for whatever reason, then that actually won't work. Okay, so now we're just going to get rid of this blank space here, and that's now nice and clean. And then we're just going to do the same sort of thing where we said add all parameter listener. We're going to now do remove all parameter listener. And then once again, since we've created this variable and attached it to this keyword, I can now just invoke that here by saying this dot param listener, and we should be good there. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another slider that's going to be very similar to what we have here with frequency. So this is going to be called volume. Okay, so we're going to make the input type equal to the same thing, range, and then we look at our min, and we're going to make this equal to minus 84. Okay, minus 84. I need to put these in quotes, minus 84. We're going to make the max equal to whatever our max is here, 6.0. And I'm sure there must be a clever way that we can make, that we can write this once and that it would populate both the Cmajor and the index and the slider side with the values, but I'm not going to worry about that for now. The initial value is going to be minus 12. Minus 12. We make the class the same thing as what we did for frequency in. So once again, it's called param. And then the ID, once again, for that dynamic type of behavior that we call in connected callback and disconnected callback, it's important that whatever we call the parameters on the Cmajor side matches up with whatever we call the parameter on the user interface side. So in this case, it is called volume. So we need to make sure that it's called volume. Okay. And then once again, I will just call this gain, and then I will close this input out with the slash input bracket. And now we should be good to go, and we should see two parameters, and both of those should update properly. Okay, so we will do Command-Shift-P and run patch. And now we have frequency and gain. So we'll turn our gain down, and gain turns down properly. Okay, and now we'll look at frequency. And we can see that that updates properly as well. So now we have a patch that is actually working. So that's really good news. So let's go ahead and just do a little bit of cleanup on this patch and create something that's a little bit cooler than just two sliders. Okay, so that's what we're going to do now. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is show you how easy it is to add images into your HTML. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to go over here to our folder structure and we're going to create a new folder, and I will just call that resources. Then in this resources folder, if I can just close this window a little bit, see if I can drag this directly into here. I actually have this audio programmer logo, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just drag that into the resources folder. Okay, so boom, right now I have a audio programmer logo that's in my resources folder, so pretty cool. Okay, so now let's go back into index.js and see what we could do there. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add this image to my HTML. And the way that I could do this, of course, I've done this previously before this tutorial, so I'm just going to type this in. You can use an image tag, so it's just img, and I'm just going to give this an ID. I will call this tap-logo. And then what I need to do is I need to point it to the source of where the actual logo is. Okay, once again, the path that we want to provide to this is relative, and so we use src, meaning source, and now we want to create a path that's relative to where our JavaScript file is. So the way that we'll do that is we will go into our development folder, into our Cmajor folder, to where this project is, just to show people once again how these actually work. And I have the Cmajor plugin. So this is the project folder that we're in. We have index.js here. And now what I'm doing is I'm going back one folder, and then interestingly, I don't see this in the right folder. So this is in view. I see what happened. I put it in the wrong place. So it's in the view folder. I need to put it here in resources. So it's on this top project level. So here we are in index.js. So we're going back one directory, and then we want to go into resources and then to tap_logo.png. Okay. So to do that, normally if you're working with something like bash script, then it would be ... but here in HTML land it's actually one single dot. And then once again, we go into our resources folder and then into the name of the actual file. And then what we could do is we could provide an alt text if the image actually isn't found. And so we'll just call this TAP logo like that. Okay. So once again, just to show you what that path is relative to what we have. So currently we're in our index.js file. Okay. So we need to point that, we need to show this where our logo actually is. And we use the dot, which means go one directory back. Then resources folder, we go into resources, and then we name the file, which is tap_logo.png. And you see that there. Okay. Now, in going up into the style section, what I will do is I'm going to just define a little bit of styling for the TAP logo. So I can just go back into view-patch-element, and then what I am going to do is I'm going to reference the ID TAP logo. Okay, so this is now styling just on the ID called TAP logo, and then in here I'm just going to put a little bit of margin around, around the top, and then how wide that I want it to be, and so on. So that's just a little bit of styling just for the TAP logo there. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is, if you recall, both of those parameters were side by side, but what if I want them just listed one above the other? So what I can do is I can actually do some styling on the parameters just by calling the .param, and that's just referring to this class called param. And then what I can do is, once again, the world's your oyster here. You could do so many different things, but I've just done some very basic things here. I was toying around with it, and I just came up with this, that I want the display to be inline blocks, so that's one above the other, and and then just gave it a little bit of margin and told it what width that I wanted it. And now I'm going to just go ahead and run that patch. And there you go. You see that we have the audio programmer logo showing properly. We have the width of frequency and gain now one on top of the other. And if I wanted to toy around with this even further, I could make frequency, the label of this, line up perfectly with the slider and so on, and you can toy around with this all day and get it to suit your needs. But this is just something basic just to show you some of the different things that you can do to set up a basic user interface. Okay, so yeah, that's essentially it. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that experience. I know that I learned a lot, and I've just been exposed to how huge the web world is in terms of ways that you can customize your user interface. And this is really going to open things up for audio plugin development and more. I'm really excited, and I hope that you are too. So if you found that video useful, be sure to give it a like, subscribe if you're not subscribed already, and I will see you soon.